The Smiths, The Queen is Dead, June 1986. This one, the Smiths' third release, is normally most fans' favorite, although I think it doesn't quite hold up as interesting as the debut, maybe because of the songs themselves, and maybe because the debut has more fuzzy, authentic, unique production compared to this album's greater polish. The album starts off very strong indeed, with a fun, sarcastic choice of a sample from a cheesy old British patriotic song from World War I, before launching into thundering drums that just don't let up, buoyed by a pretty good vocal performance, a little bit of emotional wailing here and there, great lyrics mixing romantic themes with criticizing the monarchy, and that great refrain. We can go for a walk where it's quiet and dry and talk about precious things. Cemetery Gates and Frankly Mr. Shankly really established just how great of a lyricist Morrissey is. He's in my top 5 of all time, along with people like Bob Dylan and Thom Yorke. The former song is a gentler song featuring a lot of acoustic strumming for sure, but still dependent on that similar up-tempo bass, drums, and crackly electric guitar. While Frankly Mr. Shankly is one of the most poetic and contemptuous odes to quitting your job that you'll ever hear. Big Mouth Strikes Again continues the comedy show with an iconic acoustic riff and lyrics about beating your wife and feeling self-satisfied about it, some great dancey rock sections after the first 2 verses, interspersed between continual refrains, which features some pretty funny, childlike mocking background voices. The unique catchy instrumentation continues with Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others, which has some of the band's most smooth and relaxing riffs and vocals, and the continually popular single Boy with a Thorn in His Side has vocals so passionate and yet so peaceful they border on transcendent. Nearly every fan debates over whether I Know It's Over or There Is a Light That Never Goes Out, the 3rd and 9th tracks respectively, as the real crowning track on this record, and I have a lot of trouble choosing myself. I Know It's Over is a supremely dramatic and almost cinematic depiction of hopelessness, and the longest track by a good bit, nearly 6 minutes long. Each different melodic section is perfectly chosen to fit the mood of the song. The lyrics hit hard, verse after verse. The standout section is around 4 minutes and 15 seconds when he just puts all of his heart into that refrain. There Is a Light is much more subdued, but no less emotional, filled with all sorts of catchy elements that make it probably the most popular Smith song after How Soon Is Now. You've got the great acoustic chords in the background, the repetitive drum beat, the strings in the chorus, the flute-like synthesizer sections, and of course the lyrics. Probably the greatest anthemic ode to introverts ever in music.
I'm sitting here alone in darkness, waiting to be free.
Candlemas, Epicus Dumicus Metallicus, June 1986. Back in the land of metal with the inaugural project of the entire distinct genre of doom metal, a specific brand of metal most heavily influenced by Black Sabbath, calling back to guitarist Tony Iommi's distinctive low-tuned, slow, heavy riffs that hypnotize the listener with just a wall of fuzzy sound, and lyrics about, well, doom, impending doom and loss, much more so than a good deal of Sabbath's catalog, in my opinion. Candlemas are a Swedish outfit formed in 1984 that took their name from the obscure Catholic holiday celebrating Jesus' circumcision, but they are by no means light and wholesome, with lyrics dealing with suicide, execution, sinister rituals, all the best stuff, of course. They've had quite a lot of vocalists over the years, and most of them are good. This particular debut featured a vocalist that only stuck around for this one album, Johan Längqvist, which I think helped to distinguish it as unique among their catalog, along with their great cover art. Leif Edling, the band's leader and lead guitarist, must be commended for writing so many lyrics and riffs for so many albums throughout the years, while the singers hogged the spotlight. From the very first track, we hear a deceptively pensive acoustic intro before the riff. slow, dread-filled, and menacing. It's definitely accurate to point out a distinctive influence from classical stylings, of composers like Chopin, or maybe Bach's organ works, in the menacing, funereal riffs of doom metal up to this day. Deep in a world of demon hunters, magic artifacts, and dreadful curses, Candlemas will take you on an epic journey that'll keep you entertained from start to finish. The Smiths, Louder Than Bombs, March 1987. The Smiths' other two official studio albums, Meat is Murder from '84 and Strange Ways Here We Come from '87, do have some classic songs. From Strange Ways we have the gorgeous, folky I Won't Share You and the darkly funny Girlfriend in a Coma. From Meat is Murder comes the driving guitar and biting lyrics of the essential Headmaster Ritual and the wistful melancholy of Well I Wonder. But I eventually chose to showcase a compilation album here, because, for whatever reason, a ton of great songs were unfortunately left out of the 4 official studio releases. Some of these compilations are super long, but Louder Than Bombs is short enough to be workable, I think, as an album in and of itself. You've got songs with quite upbeat instrumentation and beats like the classic Panic, Is It Really So Strange, and Ask, even some surprisingly great stabs at instrumental tracks like Oscillate Wildly. But the real reason to get this one, I think, is because it includes most of the best tracks from their first and most popular compilation album Hatful of Hollow from '84, including the bittersweet and beautiful Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now, the smooth and meditative jazzy cut This Night Has Opened My Eyes, and probably the best song under 2 minutes I've ever heard. One Man's Heart Laid Bare, melody and verses unmistakable to anyone that has dealt with depression. Please, please let me get what I want.
Panic on the streets of London, panic on the streets of Birmingham, I wonder to myself.
Candlemas, Nightfall, November 1987. After Johann Lenkvist's swift departure would come the arrival of Candlemas's most beloved of all of their many singers in Messiah Marcolin, who remained for 2 more albums after this one, and was known for the brighter, more operatic sensibility he brought to these very dark tunes. Nightfall was their second release, with the band still in top form, and Messiah chanting grandiose, poetic hymns to men condemned to die and black magic rites. The thundering, dramatic climax of the opening track, Well of Souls, after the first chorus ends, will send chills down your spine. Other standout moments are the wailing dark melodies at the end of the first verse of Samaritan, and that one single riff that suddenly bursts into life at the end of the second chorus of the album's best track, At the Gallows End. There's even some experimentation with instrumental tracks on this record that generally turn out pretty good. Depeche Mode, Violator, March 1990. I only discovered this album around 2019 or so, and so it's a bit of a stretch to say that it's extremely influential on me, but it just didn't feel right not putting a single electronic album on this list. The consistency of these tracks, a 47-minute arrangement of what I can only describe as sexy vampire music, is really striking. It only starts to get stale near the end, with Policy of Truth and Clean, although the penultimate track, Blue Dress, in between those songs is really good conversely. The first 6 songs, on the other hand, are minute-by-minute perfection. World in My Eyes is one of the most impactful opening tracks I've ever heard. Personal Jesus is good, if overrated. Enjoy the Silence is a perfect blend of danceable and edgy, but for my money, there are 3 tracks elevated above all the rest. Sweetest Perfection has smooth, honeyed, sensual vocals full of passion. Waiting for the Night will caress your ears with gentle, unobtrusive electronic sounds, and my personal favorite of all, Halo, with haunting harmonies that are seriously underrated.
One baby, two, another says I'm lucky to meet you.
Nirvana, Nevermind, September 1991. I have a complicated relationship with this record, and this band in general. I love Kurt Cobain. He's one of the most special and unique personalities, and one of the most passionate people, I think, not just in musical history, but modern history in general. And because of him, and because of their music too, Nirvana are my favorite grunge band, but there are so many other fans that just know so much more about their entire catalog than I do, and are able to appreciate their various different phases and periods, musically speaking, than I can. To me, Bleach is just too noisy, and In Utero just seems messy, unfocused, just without the same spark as this album. Even this album starts to get stale as we head into the second half, but that first half is undoubtedly a must-listen. Those first 5 tracks might be the most consistent lineup of great songs on any classic record. Polly is also pretty nice. Something in the Way was my favorite Nirvana song for a while. It's a sort of hauntingly dark folk track that sounds just a little bit like something on a black metal release. Maybe I'm just grasping at straws, but it really is great. Territorial Pissings, Drain You, fun sort of punkish tracks that I appreciate more now than I did when I was younger. All in all, not bad, and I have to give Kurt credit for getting rid of hair metal at least. REM, Automatic for the People, October 1992. Unfortunately, I haven't taken the time to listen to every one of REM's many releases, but in general in the past, if I wasn't listening to Murmur, I was listening to one of the last 3 songs on this record. My favorite out of all of them, the last track, Find the River, is an acoustic guitar-driven track with some keyboards that remain low in the mix until they suddenly get louder in order to properly accompany Michael Stipe's gorgeous vocal melody that repeats in 8 out of 13 verses, juxtaposed against a more apprehensive-sounding melody in the other 5. Night Swimming, the preceding track, is equally vulnerable and genuine, anchored by great descending piano passages, and Man on the Moon has a great rockish chorus. Everybody Hurts is, of course, classic, but it can end up sounding too sappy a lot of the time. I hadn't heard most of the songs on this album until recently, but it's really striking just how hard it is for them to miss. Drive and Try Not to Breathe are great, more fast-paced tracks. The Sidewinder Sleeps Tonight fucking rocks. All in all, this is 49 minutes well spent.
How still lies the bay in the light western.
Stan Rogers, home in Halifax, December 1992. Stanley Ellison Rogers was a Canadian folk singer mostly active in the 70s and 80s, who regaled his many fans in Canada and the United States with ballads both mournful and boisterous. celebrating the unique spirit of Canada's far eastern provinces, of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and especially Newfoundland, a relatively obscure corner of the world, blessed with a unique rocky landscape, dialect, and culture that was celebrated across his 11 records, especially with stories regarding the region's persistent economic troubles, mostly due to the decline of the fishing industry in the mid-20th century, and the passionate salt-of-the-earth working people that made Newfoundland what it was and still is. He unfortunately passed away in a plane crash in 1983, and so most of these 11 records are posthumous, both live albums and compilations. It probably would have been too easy for me to pick the rather commercially successful compilation album, The Very Best of Stan Rogers from 2011, so instead I went for this one, Home in Halifax, a live album released 11 years after its recording in the early 80s, with a wonderful assortment of tunes, delivered with Stan's rich, distinctive baritone voice that sounds a bit like mine, if I do say so myself, so you can see where the initial appeal was for me. We start off strong with the passionate crooning of the opening track, Blue Nose, about a shipwreck in Nova Scotia in 1964, continuing with the lament for the fishermen of Newfoundland make and break harbor, just wonderful melodies. A gentle love song about a family falling on hard times with the field behind the plow, Barrett's Privateers, maybe his most popular song of all, a barroom chant about 18th century Canadian pirates, some perfectly acceptable love songs like 45 Years and Lies, but maybe the two most important reasons you must listen to this album, above all the other amazing songs, is the 15th track, the Mary Ellen Carter, and Giant, a grand, poetic, pagan ballad telling a tale from Irish mythology with a penultimate verse that showcases some of the grandest vocals I've ever heard.
The wind's in the north, there'll be new moon tonight, and we have no circle to dance in her sight. So light a torch, bring a bottle, and build the fire bright. The giant will rise with the moon and crash the glass down. Move with the tide, young friends, and old whiskey are burning inside. Crash the glass down, Dingle will rise with the moon.
Burzum, Philosophem, March 1993. Black metal is a subgenre of metal known for its dissonant, distorted guitar work, often making use of alternating downward and upward strokes on a single string at high speeds to create an eerie atmosphere of dread and evil. Fast 16th note drumming, and most of all by the distinctive high-pitched screaming vocals in comparison to the low guttural vocals of death metal, as well as common lyrical preoccupations with Satanism or paganism. For my money, Bathory from Sweden was the first band to really establish the classic black metal sound in the late 80s, although a lot of earlier bands with similar fast-playing and dark themes, like Venom or Celtic Frost, are often seen as also being black metal, despite sounding pretty distinct from Bathory. Eventually, however, the torch would be passed to a particular scene of musicians based in Norway in the mid-1990s, infamous for edgy antics, misanthropic ideology, and even a string of high-profile crimes, from murder to church burning, and these are the bands that most fans consider to be actual classic black metal. Burzum, a one-man project by Varg Vikernes from western Norway, and Mayhem, a four-piece group from eastern Norway, are the two most renowned expositors of this style, and I never really got into Mayhem. Sure, I learned about their exploits and all the crazy shit that happened to them, but the music itself never really grabbed me. Burzum, on the other hand, is a different story. His first EP and first two full-lengths are pretty good, but a little generic, well, as generic as albums recorded this early in a specific genre's evolution could be, but Philosophem, and especially the release that came after it, are a lot more polished and consistent. Most black metal bands from back in the day sought an intentionally low-quality recording aesthetic, because they thought that it signaled authenticity, and Burzum was no exception. Varg actually specifically requested this album to be recorded on the worst microphone the recording studio had available, which, in this case, turned out to be a helicopter headset. The opening track, Dunkelheit. Yeah, all the song titles are in German here for some reason, despite the fact that this isn't the case on any of his other albums as far as I'm aware. Translates to darkness, which, by the way, is also what Burzum translates to in the orc language of Lord of the Rings. It crackles to life with fuzzy, eerie goodness and a little bit of drums at almost exactly the 1 minute mark, and presents us with what is most likely the most iconic riff in all of black metal. The atmosphere is so thick and the wall of sound so impenetrable, and it transitions seamlessly into the second track, Jesus Tod, which means the death of Jesus, which has this eerie Halloweeny riff, and tells an interesting story in Norwegian of a man viewing Jesus' crucifixion and sort of being the only one to know the, quote, real truth, that he is a figure of evil to be scorned for being the one to bring this oppressive religion into the world, or something like that. Erblicke die Töchter des Firmaments, or Beholding the Daughters of the Firmament, comes next with more great riffs, and lyrics inspired by Bilbo's poem from Lord of the Rings. The entire vocal aesthetic of this album dispenses with the wild animalistic screams found in the earlier releases, and in most black metal, in place of what really sounds like nothing more than whispering through an old telephone. It's pretty unique. To finish up, we've got Gebrechlichkeit, or Decrepitude, which is split into 2 parts and has a much slower, mournful, doomier pace to it, albeit with still a lot of distorted guitar interspersed with very sparse and simple synthesizer notes here and there, really adding to the atmosphere, with repetitive lyrics about a man freezing to death in a forest. The 2 parts of Gebrechlichkeit are sandwiched between a beautiful extended synthesizer piece translating to circumambulation of the transcendental columns of singularity. And finally, Gebrechlichkeit continues with part 2 being a restatement of the first, just with the guitar fading in much later to emphasize the lonely, mournful sound of the synthesizer before the instruments finally fade away for good. Burzum, Wie schließet tar os, April 1994. Burzum continued in top form in 1994 with this release, which for my money is just a little bit better than Philosophem. The record burst to life instantly with Det som en gang var, or What Once Was, a song originally recorded for his third release of the same name, with the same grinding, fuzzy guitars present on Philosophem, and a distinctive slow synthesizer beat that repeats for about 2 minutes before the drums kick in alongside a surprisingly danceable guitar groove. The song alternates expertly between thundering drum sections, guitar-oriented sections, and synth riffs, never allowing one motif to get too stale, which makes it, in my view, perhaps the best Burzum song. Although I do definitely have a soft spot for some of the lighter fare in the more recent albums, like Skiptar from 2012. Next we get the title track, which brings in a lot more unbridled aggression, with some great riffs and synth parts. The third track, In I slettet fra drömmen, In the Castle of a Dream, does tend to wear thin rather quickly with overly repetitive riffs and bass lines, And the same can be said of the overly repetitive synths in the first half of the last track. But the second half of the last track wraps up this album quite nicely indeed.
Feel it up my side. Wouldn't need no more joking. Keep me satisfied.
Jeff Buckley, Grace, August 1994. Sure, we've all heard his version of Hallelujah, but if you've never taken the time to explore his other work, you're missing out. This 1994 full-length, released just before his untimely death from drowning, has a lot of variety beyond just the basic alternative rock label it's often categorized under, but it all still has that same tone of melancholy and regret. There's not too much variety for the sake of variety, and you can still tell it was all written by the same people, sort of like what H.P. Lovecraft managed to pull off in their two albums. Jeff Buckley, the estranged son of Tim Buckley, is one of music's great unknown vocal talents, and you can hear that from the very first track, Mojo Pin, which features a great dissonant vocal melody at the end of the first verse, which is a good intro to the faster pace of the rest of the song. Jeff also plays the guitar on most of these tracks, and the inventiveness of the guitar melodies is often understated. With the second track, Grace, we've got a wonderful, ominous-sounding guitar intro, continuing into subtle, quiet vocals, and just exploding into that haunting scream. You'll know it when you hear it. Just unbelievable. One of my favorite songs ever. Last Goodbye has an interesting dynamic with instrumentation that is more upbeat than the despondent breakup lyrics would have you think, but that instrumentation is pretty good with some strong chords. Lilac Wine, a cover of a Nina Simone song, is as sweet as its namesake drink, and so real is raw and eerie, with a powerful delivery of the refrain of the title. Hallelujah, which comes in at track number 6 on this album, is great, but I think it slides into the number 3 spot in terms of quality, with Grace at the top, and the 7th track in between, Lover You Should Have Come Over, a fantastic romantic composition, with haunting organ chords leading into acoustic strumming, more organ, and even some gospel-type choirs in the background that always keeps me riveted from start to finish. Track 8 is an eerie, mysterious cover of a medieval Christmas carol delivered in a falsetto. Eternal Life is a straight-up grunge track. Dream Brother is an intriguing mix of Indian-tinged psychedelia and R&B, and the closer, Forget Her, is a despondent breakup song combining great acoustic strumming and vocals. This album is the perfect mix of artistic and accessible, and for my money, incredible. Perfect from start to finish. I can't recommend it highly enough. Ulver, Kveldsanger, March 1996. Translating as evening songs in Norwegian, this highly underrated cut really encapsulates the kind of music that I love best. Haunting, ethereal, and evocative acoustic and electric guitar music, normally accompanied by vocals, perhaps with some flute or other classical bits thrown in occasionally for good measure. If it's not coming directly from the folk scene, like from some traditional ballad, or a more modern interpretation from an English or American folk revival artist, it's normally within the context of metal. There are straight-up folk metal bands that play flutes and hurdy-gurdies over standard metal riffs, yes, and we'll get into those in a bit, and that kind of folk metal coming out of the late 2000s in Western Europe was really my bread and butter for many years, but as I get older, I find that I'm appreciating the more subtle offerings of a collection of specifically black metal bands that mix atmospheric black metal fare with melancholic fingerstyle guitar, and even a little bit of synth, clean vocals, and orchestral stuff mixed in. Kveldsanger really opened the doors for black metal bands to do stuff like that without being seen as weaklings or sellouts. It's really an exercise in musical guided imagery meditation of sorts, perfectly transporting the listener to exactly the spot shown on the cover, a dark wooded landscape, perhaps standing by a lake, with a brilliant full moon overhead. While the vocals are quite weak and more often than not highly out of tune, the classical finger-picked guitars are just layered over and over again to really envelop you in a wall of emotional energy and understated elegance. Elliott Smith, Either Or, February 1997. Elliott Smith was an American singer-songwriter that had some of the most consistently great releases of his era, following up a lackluster debut with 4 great releases before his untimely death in 2004. With vulnerable songs filled with melancholy and buoyed by lots of tasteful piano and string arrangements, as well as distinctive whispery vocals that complement the mood of his records, it's hard to pick the best Elliott Smith album, but I think this one edges out the competition. The opening track, Speed Trials, is suffused with an atmosphere of anxiety, perhaps more so than any other song on the album, built around sparse acoustic chords and even sparser lo-fi drumming. It's followed up by Alameda, one of my favorites, which has some very relaxing acoustic and electric chords and smooth vocals. Elliott would slowly add more and more electric guitar to his repertoire as the years went by, and this is a great example of that done right. Ballad of Big Nothing, the third track, is one of my favorite songs ever, and just the purest distillation of wide-eyed romantic bliss, a song that just means so much to me musically and lyrically. Between the Bars is one of his most popular songs for good reason, layered acoustic guitars with heartfelt, expertly crafted lyrics. Pictures of Me has a little edge and swagger to it. Cupid's Trick has an eerie urgency to it that I don't think I've ever heard captured in such a way in a pop song. And Angelus has some of the most interesting lyrics and one of the most iconic finger-picked intros I've ever heard. And while Punch and Judy and 2:45 AM fall flat for me, seeming a little unfocused, Say Yes is one of the best closers to any album on this list.
The car's on fire, and there's no driver at the wheel.
Godspeed You, Black Emperor, F-sharp, A-sharp, Infinity, August 1997. Godspeed You, Black Emperor is a Quebec-based experimental group associated with the musical movement known as post-rock, which is an attempt to reframe the traditional concept of rock around things like creating a hypnotic cinematic atmosphere, rather than traditional song structures, chords, or riffs, and in my view, this is one of the best examples of the style by one of its best exponents. This is a relatively bleak album with a sort of apocalyptic feel. We begin with a low drone as a man describes a scene of a city destroyed by what we're not sure, by its own fault, by war, a nuclear blast, which seeks to serve as a metaphor for pointing out the faults of Western society in general, I think. Low, slow strings drone alongside guitar, with little bits of extra dissonant string work going on in the background, which leads into eerie air raid siren-like sounds, but the guitars get more melodic as the song goes on, and it even ends with a weird section that kind of sounds a little bluegrass-like in the tone of the violin. The second track, my favorite, expands on the theme of cultural decline with a recording of a street preacher in one of the poorest sections of Vancouver, Canada, set to bagpipes for the first minute or two, and has some really eerie, menacing guitar work mixed with fast, repetitive strings, with very similar melancholic themes on the third track, dissonant horror movie guitar and ambient sounds mixed with much slower contemplative stuff. Death, The Sound of Perseverance, August 1998. Early death metal was quite a peculiar thing. Until Cannibal Corpse came along, death metal vocalists hadn't quite settled into the incredibly low guttural growling vocals, and guitarists into the incredibly low guttural growling guitar work that defines the genre now. Guitars were tuned higher, vocalists yelled instead of growled. It had a unique feel to it. A sort of particular encapsulated moment in time. All of it was a lot more similar to thrash metal. I think this is critical to understand just why Chuck Schuldiner, the lead vocalist, sounds the way he does, if you're familiar with death metal in general. It's actually strikingly similar to how distinct Varg Vikernes' vocals are compared to the rest of black metal in general. The album starts off strong with a complex drum fill, a sign of what's to come. Two things stand out as the two main motifs that Death as songwriters are most interested in: complex drum arrangements, and especially a focus on Egyptian or Middle Eastern style guitar licks that embed their way into every track without ever seeming played out. It's the perfect mixture of just that little bit of dissonance to keep it interesting and to maintain that haunting atmosphere without being grating or unpleasant. Guitar licks will just randomly stop and start throughout songs, sometimes keeping up a continuous riff, but sometimes squealing and screeching randomly both alongside and in place of a rhythm section, creating a medley of fascinating time signature changes. That's nothing new if you're a Death fan, but if you're an outsider expecting just pummeling repetitive noise, I think you'd be more than pleasantly surprised. There's bass solos, cymbal parts, and that's just the first song. There isn't really a guitar tone used that seems at all grating or formulaic. Bite the Pain has a wonderful face-melting guitar solo, The Flesh and the Power It Holds is menacing as hell, and Spirit Crusher, probably the most popular song on the album, just feels like a lumbering, plodding, menacing beast getting closer and closer to you before it finally reaches you and tears you limb from limb. Story to Tell has so much interplay going on between clean and distorted sections, different places where the music just drops and you get sucked into an effortless flow that won't let you break free until the next track begins. To Forgive is to Suffer experiments with classical influences near the end, and a moment of clarity overwhelms the senses with drum sections that are so incredibly fast that they sound like bombs falling over the countryside, in sync with slow, methodical clean guitar. Godspeed You Black Emperor, Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven, October 2000. I don't like this album nearly as much as I did when I first heard it, and I definitely prefer F-sharp A-sharp Infinity now, but it was the only Godspeed album I had listened to for a very long time, and was incredibly influential on me discovering just how diverse and interesting music can be. If it weren't for this album, a lot of the atmospheric black metal bands I care so deeply about probably wouldn't be here today. From the inspiring, uplifting strings of Storm, the first track, which lead into a faster, more chaotic section later, and the second track, Static, which features the eerie and disturbing rantings of a fringe Christian preacher mixed with some noisy, chaotic guitar. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. The word cinematic really describes his release well, I think. Tyr, How Far to Asgard, January 2002. This is a band that I called my favorite band for many years, until I really started delving into another band that I had nevertheless been listening to pretty often for about the same amount of time, and this other band did finally overtake Tyr a few years ago. Tyr are a metal band from a small chain of islands with only about 47,000 people between Iceland and Scotland called the Faroe Islands, which is a Danish colony with its own ethnic identification and its own language which is mutually intelligible with Icelandic, at least in writing. They're often classified with a folk metal label, a subgenre of metal which was first pioneered by the British band Skyclad in 1990, and a genre that features heavily on my list, which combines mostly European folk instrumentation with metal of various kinds, from black metal to traditional heavy metal. But Tyr use very little folk instrumentation in their songs, even in their many songs which are metal reworkings of traditional Faroese folk pieces. So I suppose the best way to describe them would be Viking-themed traditional heavy metal. However, Tyr's guitarist Harry Jonsson to me has a style of crafting melodies that are so unique and heavily melodic and instantly recognizable that I dare say there's a little bit of prog metal in there too. And I'm not the only one that has slapped the prog label on them, although I think the band's general consensus is to reject that label, especially since their songs aren't nearly complex or long enough. He would eventually take over as the lead vocalist for all of Tyr's albums after this one, but I personally think this first vocalist, Paul Arne Holm, is the better pick. Most of the songs here are actually sort of forgettable in terms of the vocal melodies and lyrics, but the guitar melodies are just so uniquely great that you gotta admit this would work pretty well as an instrumental prog album. The exceptions to the unfocused nature of most of the vocal melodies and lyrics here are The Rune, a grand sweeping tale of the life of Eric the Red, Hail to the Hammer, a fun upbeat track that's always been popular, and as well the dramatic manly hymn of Ormurinn Langi, based off a much longer traditional Faroese ballad about the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000 between the famous Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason and the combined Danish and Swedish forces. Also worth checking out, although not quite as good, are two other Faroese language ballads on the 2008 re-release of this album. Falconer, Chapters from a Vale Forlorn, March 2002. Falconer was a Swedish power metal group that had a number of releases in the past 20 years. Power metal is a variety of metal most heavily influenced by 80s metal artists like Iron Maiden and Yngwie Malmsteen, that took a more light-hearted, melodic approach compared to the majority of metal subgenres like doom, thrash, death metal, black metal, and so forth. Lyrics are often uplifting, about triumphing over adversity rather than wallowing in it, and normally include lyrical themes of fantasy fiction, conquering heroes and historical themes and so forth. Musically, power metal is mostly distinct for having a very prominent role for drumming, with incredibly high vocals and incredibly fast double bass drums creating a distinctive style that takes some getting used to and can be repetitive a lot of the time. Falconer, thankfully, are an exception to the repetitiveness. They have great melodies, memorable riffs, and my personal pick for my favorite singer of all time, Matthias Blad, although he's certainly far from influential in rock music generally. He has a warm baritone voice that stands out amongst the horde of super high-pitched vocalists that power metal normally employs. Most of their songs are one-off short stories about medieval-esque fantasy settings that dispense with such topics as stereotypical Viking adventures, as many Scandinavian metal bands seem to rely on. This album is their second release, and the second best album they ever made, I think. There's Decadence of Dignity, a story about a medieval kingdom led astray by rampant greed with some great riffs on the chorus. Enter the Glade and Lament for a Minstrel both have great vocal melodies, and For Life and Liberty is one of Falconer's many odes to an oppressed people rising up and claiming victory. This album also features Portals of Light, a beautiful song about mourning a lost love, and The Clarion Call, perhaps Falconer's most popular song, with a great vocal performance and a catchy chorus. Blind Guardian, A Night at the Opera, March 2022. This is another power metal album from one of the most distinctive and influential bands of the genre. Based in Germany, Blind Guardian are known for the distinctive stylings of vocalist Hansi Kirsch, who can alternate between low and gruff, all the way up to incredibly high-pitched vocals with ease. Alongside the vocal range, they're probably most known for their heavy use of layered vocals, which in my view can get a little stale once you realize they use them on basically every song they've ever written. Hansi Kirsch's main influence in terms of inspiring him to make use of so much layered vocals was Queen, and so this album, probably their most acclaimed release, is directly named after the famous 1975 Queen album, which is also normally thought of as Queen's best. This album is power metal with an uncharacteristic level of aggression, from the intense riffs of Precious Jerusalem to the medieval masterpiece of Battlefield, with its great anthemic chorus, and the emotional vocal performances and varied musical motifs on Age of False Innocence and Then There Was Silence. And all of the songs are still good, despite me only having listened to half of them until I started writing this, including a number of various European language covers of a folk track from their previous album. I'm no Blind Guardian expert, but I've always wanted to see them live, and for what it's worth, a lot of people think they have one of the most consistent multi-album runs of any metal band between Somewhere Far Beyond and this album. They also have some of the most varied lyrical topics of any band on this list, really delving deep into the crevices of Gen X nerd culture and taking inspiration from all sorts of fantasy novels mostly, famous and obscure ones, as well as movies and historical topics. Really interesting. I mean, they made a whole album about the Silmarillion, for God's sake, Nightfall in Middle-earth.
Harvest of sorrow, your seed is grown in a frozen wood full of cries. When the ray of light shrinks, shall cold winter nights begin.
Interpol, Turn on the Bright Lights, August 2002. Interpol are a New York City indie band that I first came across after searching the internet to try and find a band that came close to the unique atmosphere of Unknown Pleasures, and which started me on a path to appreciating more and more indie music as the years went by. This is a grand, sweeping musical statement, filled with layered guitars and emotional vocal performances, anchored by that sort of Joy Division-esque menacing pounding bass. This is a dark, brooding record, with a lot of variety. The band lulls you into a false sense of security by the opening track, Untitled, which is rather upbeat and almost totally instrumental, with a lot of interesting guitar motifs that fade in and out, before breaking into Obstacle 1, a great mixture of different rock riffs playing off of one another, with a strong, impactful chorus both musically and vocally. The bridge after the second chorus is masterful in how much it packs in, unexpectedly fast drums and guitar, and some haunting outro vocal melodies. We continue on with NYC, which is reflective and bittersweet and romantic, and has a sort of background guitar line strummed really fast and really high that's very much post-rock, I think, and a random album title drop that comes as two different vocal lines repeat over one another, one more chilled out, another urgent and anxious. PDA brings us back to the hard-driving angst of Obstacle 1, but with a more light-hearted chorus and a great instrumental section for the final 2 minutes of the song. Really, the riffs on every track are great. Even if the band aren't on the top of their game every minute, there's always something interesting on each track. I also want to highlight Stella Was a Diver and She Was Always Down, the 8th song on this album, so danceable and unique, and the last song, my favorite, Leif Erikson, with a great intro vocal melody. Agalloch, The Mantle, August 2002. Agalloch are an Oregon four-piece band rooted in the musical style and atmosphere of black metal that nevertheless took influence from many other genres, mostly folk, and particularly the European folk subgenre known as neo-folk, which began in the 1980s and sought to embody themes of introspection, melancholy, and political commentary to minor key acoustic folk music with a significant amount of industrial influences. You won't really hear the industrial influences in Agalloch, but the minor key acoustic folk, as well as some influence from post-rock, is certainly a key part of their whole deal, and has been for their entire discography of just 5 main albums so far since 1999. I first discovered them a while back after listening to a bunch of their songs on a specific YouTube channel that paired the music with black and white photographs of forests and mountainsides in winter, and was immediately drawn in by the images that flashed in my head as I listened. And I said Tyr haven't been my favorite band for a few years, well, this is my actual favorite band. The Mantle, their second album, is often considered to be Agalloch's best, and it begins with a somber, repetitive acoustic riff accompanied by the slow pound of militaristic drums in the song A Celebration for the Death of Man, which, in my view, is not necessarily celebrating literally the extinction of humanity, but rather for humanity as we know it. Celebrating a possible future collapse of society, but a rebuilding after the fall into a more environmentally sustainable and harmonious future. And to think I got all of that out of just the title of an instrumental song. It transitions seamlessly into In the Shadow of Our Pale Companion, my personal favorite song of all time, a nearly 15-minute epic which actually continues to use the exact same acoustic riff as the first song throughout nearly the entire thing, mixing solid drum beats, the crash of fuzzy chords, and lyrics about coming to appreciate the divine within nature after a long quest for truth. The entire song is great, with so much variety, but the best part would have to be the dramatic increase in tempo around 10 minutes and 10 seconds, with pounding military drums and what I can only describe as dueling guitar crescendos coming to a satisfying climax, although the song continues on for a few more minutes with some more mellow motifs. Odal is probably their most distinctly post-rock track. Very introspective, I mean it begins with the sound of wind. I found a really great video of this song where someone had used footage from a mountain in Montana in the fall, which really captures the point of the song, I think. A great musically diverse track that means a lot to me. The Lodge is very atmospheric. They use a deer skull as percussion in the intro, great electric guitar lines that fade in and out. You Were But a Ghost in My Arms is oriented around this crushing wall of sound, and the Cold Death of the Earth probably slides into the number 2 slot in terms of quality for me, with diverse acoustic and electric riffs, double bass passages, and I mean the string instrument, not the drum, and environmentalist lyrics and musical motifs that call back to the opening track. The Hawthorne Passage, vocalist and main songwriter John Hamm's personal favorite Agalog song, is also a fan favorite, with chilled-out electric guitar motifs spread over 2 distinct sections, and Desolation Song is a folk tune with the most bare-bones aesthetic out of all the tracks, except maybe the opening track. This record might be the definition of atmospheric black metal, with the images and emotions it creates, of trudging through the snowy wilderness, the hero's journey with its ups and downs, and the feeling of completion and success after accomplishing great things and learning about life along the way. All in all, fascinating, groundbreaking, my favorite album ever. Opeth, Damnation, April 2003. I think you'll start to see a pattern emerging of me being really into releases from metal bands that aren't metal, what with Kveldsanger and all the rest. This is another one of those. Opeth are a seminal and influential death metal band from Sweden, with multiple solid metal releases and a handful of prog rock records. Damnation was Opeth's first foray into an all-acoustic, no death growls release, but this album has defied even categorization into basic genres since it was first dropped. It's not nearly guitar-dominated enough to be a rock album. There's too many different instruments for it to be a folk record, and not enough different instruments for it to be a classical release. This is a jazz album, undoubtedly so, anchored by 2 of the most important instruments of late 20th century and 21st century jazz, the electric guitar and piano. It's not wild and chaotic, but it's not necessarily totally chill either. This is a dark, gothic jazz album that rewards multiple listens. We start off with one of the strongest opening tracks of any album on this list, Windowpane. Amazing guitar solo, silky, buttery, smooth tone, interesting, spooky keyboards. In My Time of Need has one of my favorite Opeth choruses, mixing restrained yet still impactful vocal styles with more dramatic flair. And what a great outro. The synergy between the acoustic guitar, keyboards, and that low, subtle bass line.
And I should contemplate this change, ease the pain. And I step out of the ring, turn away.
Then we've got Death Whispered a Lullaby, that starts out with some ominous Spanish guitar and some really great harmonies on the vocal refrain. Even a weird spacey electric solo that is really unexpected in a song about mourning the death of a child. Really interesting. Closure has never really hit that hard for me, but there is an instrumental break in the middle of that song that's very classic and iconic. Hope Leaves and To Rid the Disease are also both pretty popular, the latter being a good bit darker, and the former more chill. To Rid the Disease has an interesting piano and bass combination in the second half. Ironically, the song Ending Credits is actually the second to last song on the album, and is this record's only instrumental track, with some unexpected Latin music sounding guitar passages, and then of course we've got the final song, Weakness, with some spacey, spooky keyboards, and fittingly the album's weakest track. But honestly, it's still alright. This album rocks. Highly recommended.
What will they say when I am gone? I want my memory to be mild. I want it to glow upon my pages, blood is stained.
Tear, Eric the Red, June 2003. Tear would return in 2003 with a much more solid set of songs than the debut album, although unfortunately we'll never know how they would have sounded sung by Paul Arne Holm in his prime, since Harry Jensen took over his job, but in all honesty, Harry is still a pretty good singer. The opening track, The Edge, is another long, epic melodic track in the style of The Rune from the previous album, recounting the story of a particular character from Nordic history. In this case, instead of a chieftain and explorer in The Rune, we've got a retelling of the exploits of a coterie of bandit rebel warriors from the Faroe Islands called the Floksmen, which includes a very clever and fun Faroese to English twist in the chorus that I think you'll find interesting. Reyn Smuir, meaning Regan the Smith, is a great metal reworking of a Faroese traditional song. This album also includes the two Faroese traditional songs that were present on the 2008 re-release of their debut, those being Ólafur Rauðaros and Sýris Vólarin. Dreams is a song that's super underrated among Tear fans, a lot of beautiful vocal melodies. Alive is a song that never really stuck in my memory for whatever reason through the years, but it is fantastic, with an aggressive intro leading into really mellow prog sections. It does seem a little unfocused at times, with a significant amount of variety throughout this 7.5-minute song, and plus the lyrics are more philosophical and abstract rather than telling a concrete story like most of Tear's songs, which I think might be the reason why this song isn't talked about as much, but it's still good. My standout pick alongside The Edge would definitely be Ramon til Unge, a metal reworking of a Danish folk song about a 17th century warrior slaughtering a kingdom full of fearsome giants with his great and terrible sword called Dimling the Red. Unfortunately, I would say that the weakest track on this record is actually the title track. It just seems to have a similar unfocused and meandering nature to Alive, but just without being able to be salvaged by the end in the way that Alive definitely is. But it's still an album that comes recommended by me, for sure. Josh Groban, Closer, November 2003. It was very difficult to pick a favorite Josh Groban album. Awake from 2006 has the brazenly romantic So She Dances and a gut-punch vocal performance on the chorus of Mai, Italian for May. His debut self-titled has a track adapted from the main love theme from the 1988 Italian movie Cinema Paradiso, with lyrics specifically written for him to stand in for the violin melody in the original, which is one of my favorite operatic songs of all time. But eventually I settled on the second of his 3 truly great albums from this early 2000s era. It is one of his best performances with the soulful Per Te, the passionate paean to lost love in impeccable Spanish, that is, Si volvieras a mí, and of course the still unbeatable You Raise Me Up, mine and probably most people's first encounter with his music, even if it's not my favorite song of his, closing out the album with a bang.
Ay, si volvieras a mí, encendería el sol 1000 primaveras.
Megahertz 5, May 2004. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't include an album from the first metal band I ever listened to, Rammstein. But the German industrial metal scene of the 2000s, then called Neue Deutsche Härte, or New German Hardness by the press, had a lot more interesting stuff going on than just that one band. Here, I'd like to highlight another example of German industrial metal. Here we have probably the second or third most well-known band of the style after Rammstein. I'm speaking of Megahertz. This is, naturally, their 5th album out of 9 so far, and my favorite. This album features a very talented singer named Matthias Eisholz that stands out from the pack of normally deeper-voiced singers in most of the German industrial bands that I've listened to. Perhaps most of them are just trying to pay homage to Rammstein, not sure. Anyway, the opener, Dein Herz schlägt, or Your Heart Beats, is pretty great. Frantic, aggressive, with great vocal stylings that are a lot more animalistic and almost a little black metal-y, although I'm not entirely certain if any of the band members would know what black metal even is. Göttlich, or Divine, is pretty good, with a very melodic refrain. You know, this isn't really a group you come to for interesting or inventive riffs or guitar passages. They really carry themselves almost solely through vocal melodies, and also through their lyrics. I'm really fascinated by just how much this German industrial metal scene are able to create these little one-off stories for each of their songs, lyrically speaking, that are all unique and immersive and well-written, while still being firmly grounded in ordinary emotions and ordinary human events, rather than looking into fantasy or literary elements like a lot of power metal or traditional 80s heavy metal. Ja Genau is a really standout track. It involves an interesting bit of rapping that you wouldn't think I would like, but I do, and a very nice cleaner riff halfway through that is sort of melancholic and nostalgic and reminds me a bit of stuff like Evanescence. This album also features a re-recording of apparently one of their most famous songs, Gott sein, or To Be a God, but personally, I can't figure out why this song is so popular other than for the edgy, contrarian, anti-Christian aspects. Speaking of bland edginess, this pretty much sums up my feelings about the 6th track, Mach dich frei, or Free Yourself, and to a lesser extent also the following track, Eigentlich, or Actually, but tracks 8 through 10 are super consistently great. Zeig mir dein Gesicht, or Show Me Your Face, has a great driving beat and a great vocal refrain. Ebbe und Flut, Ebb and Flow, has a catchy riff and well put together chorus, and that second verse is just dripping with malice. Deine Seele zurückzuhalten, in der Faust der Geballten. Just really well done. Komm rüber ins Schattenland, or Come Back to the Land of Shadows, tells a really fun story. Track 9 is a bit forgettable, but the closer, Augenblick, is a great ballad, very memorable with strong vocals. As I said, I haven't listened to anything Megahertz has put out past this album, but I do recommend looking into their stuff earlier than this, with Alexander Wieselski on vocals instead of Matthias Eisholz. I personally haven't heard any of those releases front to back, but I know a few songs on each of them. Alexander Wieselski is also known for singing in Eisbrecher, which is another popular band in the German industrial metal scene, although by now he's left the job of Megahertz vocalist to someone else and left himself with just Eisbrecher.
Ganz nah zu dir hin. Nach der Ebbe kommt die Flut. Alles bleibt in Erinnerung. Dein Gott, dein Blut. Alles bleibt bei dir.
Rammstein, Rise, Rise, September 2004. Sure, the guitar riffs aren't exactly breaking new ground from standard modern metal, just like Megahertz, but Till Lindemann's poetic, disturbing, and widely varied lyrical content is always top-notch, and his voice is virtually always perfect, even on their most recent album from only a couple years ago. For the first song on this album I ever listened to, and the first Rammstein song period, was actually Amour, an incredibly underrated track that is particularly notable for having what I think is Till's deepest, gruffest, and graveliest vocal performance of his entire catalog. Another vocal standout is the gorgeous track Morgenstern, or Morning Star. The music video for Keine Lust is incredibly funny, the Mein Teil video is properly disturbing and shocking as it should be for those who haven't heard of the song before, and the political satire on Moscow and America is very refreshing. But only one song has the anthemic, soaring vocal performance and melody to make this album truly great. The title track, Rise, Rise. I always turn it up high and bang my head in sync as if on cue whenever it comes on. That chorus, man, it's something else. Other possible inclusions for a top-tier Rammstein number might have been Mutter, with its tortured, stirring operatic performances on Mein Herz brennt and title track, or the release following Rise, Rise, being Rosenrot, with the unbridled aggression of Zerstören, the creepy, intense vocal performance of Feuer und Wasser, and the absolutely magnificent storytelling and narrative presented on Hilf mir. But this is for albums that have affected my life and my music taste, not necessarily the best albums, so we'll leave it there. Heidevolk, De Strijdlust is geboren, March 2005. Heidevolk is a Dutch folk metal band that attempts to show the world a small slice of the folk traditions of their native province of Gelderland, in the east of the Netherlands. They're known for driving, strong riffs and deep vocals and layered choruses, and have only gotten more popular as the years go by. This is a very solid release, with a standout track being Het Gelders Volkslied, a metal reworking of the provincial anthem of Gelderland. The 2008 re-release also adds Wodan Herst, a solid driving metal tune describing the exploits of Odin in the Norse myths, and the magnificent Vulgaris Magistralis, a novelty comedy song cribbed from an 80s Dutch country rock outfit called Normaal, about a caveman that has survived to the present day who hides from the modern world in his cave and rides his mammoth and mastodon around the Dutch countryside scaring innocent civilians. Fun stuff. From the riff-filled goodness of Falla Aua or Rugged Old One to folk tunes like En wij stappen stevig voort and We firmly march forward, there's a lot here to appreciate for any fan of folk metal or old school heavy metal. Arkona, Voslavu Veliki, September 2005. Another European folk metal release, this time from the foggy marshes and freezing birch forests of Russia. This critically acclaimed foursome combines elements of hard-driving metal with a range of Russian folk instruments, which I admit I'm not particularly familiar with, but I do know enough to recognize a jaw harp and a flute and an accordion out of the lot, plus clean vocals layered with chorus effects to recreate something similar to one of my favorite musical styles ever, the traditional Russian style of choral singing, dissonant and haunting, which altogether make for perhaps the most interesting and evocative folk metal band of all time, except for maybe one other which I'll get to later. Their frontwoman, Masha Arkhipova, is also known for being one of the most skilled female harsh vocalists in the scene, which you can really hear on standout tracks like Skvoz Tuman Vekov, translated as Through the Mist of Ages, as she belts out hymns to forgotten Slavic gods with mystical names like Svarog or Perun. From lightning-fast Iron Maiden-esque tracks interspersed with just as fast accordion passages like Zov Bitvi or The Call of Battle, to balalaika and synthesizer passages on a solid closer's track, Sila Slavnych, translating to Virtue of the Glorious. There's very little here that's bland or derivative. Agalok, Ashes Against the Grain, August 2006. The Portland, Oregon foursome would come roaring back 4 years after the release of The Mantle with a follow-up record that's almost as good as its predecessor. This project is about 10 minutes longer than The Mantle, and has fewer but longer songs. The opener, Limbs, starts off with a slow, atmospheric electric guitar passage before leading into fairly simple metal riffs that start to speed up alongside heavier drum beats at around 2 minutes and 40 seconds in. Afterwards, we're treated to an unexpected set of darker, spookier acoustic and electric passages before the vocals kick in, and after that, we wind down with a short doom metal interlude and a great, less distorted repeating motif to finish it off. We then get Falling Snow, the next track probably the most popular and best one on the album, a wonderful collage of melodic cleaner riffs that fade in and out over a wall of distortion, and pretty atmospheric clean vocal performances too. The snow has fallen and raised this white mountain on which you will die and fade away in silence. Then immediately going into this faster set of riffs that doesn't let up until the end. Great stuff. After that, we get a short ambient synth interlude that fits the mood well, and then it's time for Fire Above, Ice Below, which in my personal judgment is Agalok's softest electric song that they've ever made, with some great repeating motifs and strummed electric chords. Not Unlike the Waves is another great one, with poetic lyrics, followed up by Our Fortress is Burning, which, depending on who you ask, is either one 18-minute long track or 3 separate ones. Part 1, which is untitled, Part 2, which is Bloodbirds, and finally, The Grain, of which the second section, Bloodbirds, is normally seen as the most impactful and emotional of the 3 sections. I see the entire piece as portraying the fortress that it refers to, as a sort of woodland sanctuary or village inhabited by an isolated, peaceful tribe that's under attack by an outside force. Or perhaps the fortress that's burning could be a metaphor for the environmental destruction of the entire planet as a whole. The lyrics here, which are the only lyrics in this section, are suitably ambiguous. The god of man is a failure. Our fortress is burning against the grain of the shattered sky. Charred birds escape from the ruins and return as a cascading flood. Dying bloodbirds pooling, feeding the flood. The god of man is a failure, and all of our shadows are ashes against the grain. The third section is a suitably despondent and eerie ambient droning wall of noise, fitting for the eerie silence after a bloody massacre. And these themes and ambient motifs are continued on the final song, Scars of the Shattered Sky, subtitled Our Fortress Has Burned to the Ground, which veers off into an unexpectedly rockish section at around 14 minutes and 15 seconds in, and is a song which was only present on the vinyl version. Tyr, Ragnarok, September 2006. By 2006, in my estimation, this greatest of Nordic bands would reach the pinnacle of their artistic achievement and the pinnacle of this classic 4-album run with the best of the 4, Ragnarok. The centerpiece of this record and the anchor to the other songs here and the musical motifs that they're trying to establish is the title track, and the last main song, Ragnarok. There's a lot of really short instrumental guitar interludes interspersed between the songs. I think they were kinda sorta going for a prog concept album type thing with those interludes, but they didn't quite reach it in my view. Anyway, the closing track has this opening guitar melody that is reflected in the first song, one of Tyr's few full-length instrumental songs, aptly simply titled The Beginning, and that closing track also has a few guitar motifs that are used in a couple of other songs on the album. Very good track. Another amazing track, The Hammer of Thor, which is a faithful retelling of the story of the forging of Thor's hammer in the Norse sources, with very high literary lyrics, likely from the perspective of Loki. It has soft parts, a great heavier beginning to the chorus, which leads into a more melodic section by the time the chorus is over. Envy is beautiful, almost a Baroque piece, at 1 minute and 10 seconds. Honestly, all of the little shorter interludes are great. Brothers Bane and Ride to Hell are really, despite being vocal pieces, mostly just good as instrumental pieces, though I'm not a huge fan of the vocal melodies there, but oh man, is the 7th track great. Thorstein's Kvein. This is the first Faroese language song on the album, and it tells the story of, Norwegian king and his son. I'm kind of fuzzy on the details, but the lyrics are cool if you look them up. Wings of Time, the 9th track, is so good. It combines simple yet thoughtful lyrics with a chorus which takes its wording from a completely unrelated traditional Faroese ballad called Grimur Mjolnesi, about a farmer and his wife who come across a witch in the forest. I guess they just thought it sounded good despite the difference in theme. And the track preceding Wings of Time is an authentic older recording of Grimur Mjolnesi being sung in that traditional choral style, so that's pretty cool. But the way everything comes together on Wings of Time itself, The way that progression slowly advances as Harry sings the refrain a second time, the emotion in his voice, just magic. We then get one of my favorite rock instrumentals of all time. Directly after that, Rage of the Skullgaffer, a dual guitar shredding track, sort of classical again in its influence. The Hunt directly after that has more classical influenced electric guitar playing, including reusing the intro to Rage of the Skullgaffer a couple times. Really, such complex compositions, even if the vocal melodies are a bit formulaic sometimes. Lord of Lies is pretty similar to The Hunt, I think, although I'm willing to listen to alternative opinions on that. But Ragnarok is just such a great closer. A nice guitar intro, probably my favorite vocal performance from Harry Jonsson ever in that first Faroese verse. Very subtle, very controlled, very melodic, with just a hint of dark energy, and the melodies in the rest of the verses are great too. It's a song about, well, Ragnarok of Norse myth, but I also sort of interpret it as about people coming together and overcoming oppression in our own human lives, as it were. Ultimately, a great, classic, old-school style heavy metal album, with progressive uses of musical interludes with neoclassical motifs and high-concept poetic lyrics. A record like no other. One of my favorites.
North wind, embrace me as I face the horizon. Carry me safe for shore as you did my brethren of yore.
Falconer, Northwind, November 2006. Between their second release, Chapters from a Vale Forlorn, which I brought up earlier, and this one, Falconer employed Christopher Goebel as a vocalist in place of Matthias Blad, and their prominence in the power metal scene as well as the reviews of their albums plummeted, all the way until Blad was finally reinstored to his rightful place on this album, their fifth release, which shows them back in top form with a wonderful slab of metal with diverse themes and motifs, which is just a little better than Chapters, I think. There's Perjury and Sanctity, a tune about a corrupt official, or Home of the Knave, a tale of a warrior king on a march. Standout tracks include the gorgeous love song Long Gone By and the title track, Northwind. But the real reason to check out this album is for the various bonus tracks in the Digipack CD version, which you can find easily on YouTube, which are a collection of artful, delicate Swedish folk songs done in a metal style.
Your sins are not redeemed by swearing perjury. Your sense of self-esteem has miles to go to sanctity.
Alceste, Souvenir d'un autre monde, September 2007. This French band, founded by underground metal luminary and trailblazer Stéphane Poe, known professionally simply as Neige or Snow in French, is undoubtedly the single most important group to pioneer the fusion of black metal and shoegaze music, which really took off commercially after the release of the second record by the band, Deafheaven, a San Francisco-based five-piece group that is, I think, still quite in the middle of taking the world by storm, even after 9 years since their big break with their album Sunbather, which you may have heard of. Shoegaze music, however, for those of you with more time on your hands than sense, is a style of alternative rock characterized by slow, atmospheric guitar riffs drenched in reverb, normally with more upbeat themes and a very different aesthetic to superficially similar genres that rely on a wall of sound, like drone metal, for example, let alone the dark themes of black metal. The vocals of shoegaze are normally obscured behind the crushing wall of sound that distinguishes shoegaze from post-rock for the most part, and the name of the genre itself comes from the fact that most of the music is heavily dependent upon guitar effects pedals, and so the band members have to be staring at their shoes in order to get the pedals working right. Seminal releases in the shoegaze genre include Souvlaki by Slowdive and Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, one of the most famous alternative music releases of all time, although one that I think is incredibly overrated. It's this wall of noise that Alcest most definitely are faithfully emulating on this, their debut album, Souvenir d'un autre monde, translating as Memories from Another World. The album cover, I think, is among those that fit the best with what the music is trying to portray out of any album on this list. A look into a more innocent, peaceful land beyond the one we know, like on the final track, Tir na Nog, which those of you familiar with Celtic mythology will know as the Irish conception of the afterlife in the old sources. This is a great relaxing, meditative closing track with guitars and pianos. This album is pretty light on lyrics, which I think makes the ideas and landscapes and emotions he's trying to paint in our heads with what lyrics this album does have more vivid and impactful. For example, there's only a single paragraph of lyrics stretched out over 7 minutes on the opening track, Printemps Émeraude, or Emerald Spring, which has a great, vaguely dissonant acoustic motif that comes in at around 4 minutes in. The title track, track number 2, has an iconic acoustic intro helped along by an accompanying electric melody, and is full of vitality and emotion from start to finish. Les Iris, or The Irises, takes an overall darker turn, though this track is still full of variety, and I think it shines especially when the guitars are used primarily as window dressing for Nej's vocal melodies. This description also fits well for the mood of Sur l'autre rive je t'attendrai, which means on the other shore I will wait for you, which is even more aching and bittersweet, and features a bit of female vocal talent from Audrey Sylvain, a person who has been present on and brings a lot of unique presence to a lot of different black gaze style releases over the years. The only song that I think is a little generic is Ciel Errant, or Wandering Sky. The acoustic and electric riffs both just aren't that interesting, I think. I highly recommend their later albums, Spiritual Instinct and Écailles de Lune, translating as Moon Scales, both of which are a good deal better than Souvenir, I think, but I had to pick their debut album because that was the one album of theirs that I actually knew about until pretty recently. Les Voyages de l'Âme, or Voyage of the Soul, is also a pretty good release, but not as good as Écailles de Lune or Spiritual Instinct. Kodama, I think, despite being possibly their most popular release of all, is actually one of their most boring albums. But one of the cool things about Alcest is you can kind of pick up from anywhere and get basically the same thing no matter which album you start with the exception of Souvenir and Shelter, which are more distinct. Souvenir really standing out for its more lo-fi fuzzy production, and Shelter for not including any screamed vocals at all. Arkona, Od Serca k Niebu, October 2007. Arkona followed up their fantastic 2005 release with another great record mixing folk instrumentation, synth, metal stylings, and traditional Russian choral singing, titled Od Serca k Niebu, or From the Heart to the Skies. We start off with 3 minutes of nature sounds, jaw harp noises, and synths, before suddenly being jerked awake by a spooky minor key riff, low, aggressive vocals, and manly chanting. Entitled Pokrovi Niebiesnego Starca, or Shroud to the Celestial Sage, I really enjoy the sections where the metal riffs are accompanied by a particular string instrument. I think it could be a hurdy-gurdy. I don't think it's an accordion, at least not for most of the song. Then we get track number 2, Goi Kupala, which mixes some pretty dense, chuggy start-and-stop riffs with some acoustic guitar chords and some chanting from vocalist Masha Arkhipova. I have 3 standout picks on this album: the title track and Oi Pechal Toska, translating to Oh Sadness and Melancholy, both of which have great synergy between metal riffs and folk instrumentation coming in on top, where the melodies actually fit together instead of distinguish themselves too much from each other. And Otse Saknebu, the title track in particular, has a fantastic vocal melody on the refrain, but the number 1 top spot for me would be track number 7. It starts off sounding just a bit like an ordinary generic black metal song, but just with some beautiful choral chanting coming in later, a prayer to a sacred eagle spirit. It would be pretty great a cappella altogether, but is improved a lot by metal riffs that come in and out. Overall, a fantastic record. My knowledge of Arcona's catalog, apart from these 2 specific records that I've showcased, is pretty spotty, but like Megahertz, I do enjoy at least a couple songs on each album that I've heard.
Ой, как я выбегу, пробегу, кручу вдоль по берегу. Ой, как головушку светлую склоню над берегами. Тропою по ветрам от сердца до к небу, рекою прольет.
Elvedi, Slania, February 2008. While they're not the first folk metal band in history, that would be Skyclad from England, as I mentioned earlier, they were my first introduction to the genre. This large ensemble act hails from Winterthur, Switzerland, and had their first release 2 years before this one. The name itself references the name of the Helveti, the native Celtic inhabitants of Switzerland prior to the Roman conquest, which makes Elvedi the only group featured here from any genre to be influenced not necessarily just by earlier 20th century forms of rock music, nor just medieval melodies, but straight up ancient themes and ideas. The entire band is a celebration of ancient Celtic culture, which predominated in most of Europe, again prior to the Roman conquest, and while there's no such thing as authentic written Celtic notated melodies from ancient times to draw on in archaeological sources, Elvedi's lyrics make up for it, telling dramatic stories of war, resistance, loss, faith, hope, and an honoring of nature as well across 8 albums in 20 years. Elvedi's single biggest musical influence is the European melodic death metal scene of the late 90s and early 2000s, particularly the seminal Swedish band Dark Tranquillity, but they will often also crib from famous old Irish melodies that will be interspersed into their own original tunes, and of course, the folk instrumentation is varied and rich. Bodhran, tin whistle, Uilleann pipes, mandolin, bagpipes for God's sake, and probably their favorite instrument that they use, the hurdy-gurdy, courtesy of Anna Murphy, one of the longest-lasting members who unfortunately is off on her own at this point. This band is also unique for incorporating into their lyrics widespread use of the ancient Gaulish language that was spoken throughout most of the area of ancient Celtic settlement, particularly in France and Switzerland and Belgium, which required a lot of hard work and consultation with professors of linguistics to be able to pull off this level of reconstruction of such an old language with such few written attestations. And much of this album and other Elvedi albums' lyrics are taken directly from original Celtic writing sources such as shards of pottery or inscriptions on statues. In terms of the record itself, we start off with the glorious Samon, the opening track, one of my favorite opening songs in this video. Then on to track number 2, Primordial Breath, an aggressive, emotional death metal piece that knows what it wants to be and doesn't let up. I particularly like the guitar and folk instrumental break after the second chorus, and the vocal melody of the chorus in general. This same synergy of metal riffs and particularly flute and hurdy-gurdy passages played in both interludes and over the riffs leads to just great songs one after the other. Grace Sublime Archon, the somber lay, and particularly the mournful, intense chorus on the 11th song, Calling the Rain, my personal top pick. The two most popular songs on the album, however, and two of the most popular Elvedi songs overall, are Slania's Song, an all-Gaulish language track telling the tale of a tribal chieftain and his love for his homeland, and Innis Mona, a track named for a historically important corner of Britain, namely the Welsh island of Anglesey, which was an independent holdout against Roman occupation for many years during their conquest of the main island of Britain in the 1st century AD. The melody of the chorus is taken from Tri Martolod, an early 20th century folk song from the western French province of Britain, which has its own Celtic identity and language known as Breton, and which was made famous in the early 1970s by a pioneering harp player and composer called Alan Stivell. We can't leave off without talking about the fantastic instrumental songs, from Samon to the beautiful piano and guitar passages on Guillamonios, and the violin piece and stately funeral dirge of Anagantios. All three are named after different months in the ancient Gaulish calendar. I'll be the first to admit this band aren't for everyone, what with the death metal focus, first of all, but also the heavy folk instrumentation, and the focus on a period of history that is rather rarely studied and appreciated, namely the ancient Celtic culture. But if you like any of those three things, I would definitely recommend giving Elvedi a shot. Agalloch, The White, February 2008. This album is the fourth of Agalloch's 5 EPs, released between Ashes Against the Grain and their fourth full-length Mirror of the Spirit, which took a much heavier turn, and one of only 3 EPs I've chosen to feature out of all 85 of these albums. The White takes a lot of influence from film, with 3 samples from the famous British cult horror classic and my favorite movie of all time, The Wicker Man, with Christopher Lee from 1973. Naturally, with Agalloch's pagan influences, it's a good fit with one of the most pagan films ever made. Even 2 of the 7 songs on this half-an-hour-long record are named for the island that the plot of the movie takes place in. The first track, The Isle of Summer, a gorgeous melancholic folk melody tinged with a teensy bit of rock, and the last song, a much more somber, heavier piece, entirely done on piano, called Summer Isle Reprise. There are plenty of other tracks worth listening to that aren't tied to the Wicker Man film, however, from Birch Black, which makes use of the classic Agalloch military drum sound which pops up occasionally on the mantle, and has a heavier section starting around the first minute in, and Pantheist, a dark, stirring acoustic guitar piece featuring the sound of a rushing stream at the beginning that was one of the first songs I unsuccessfully tried to learn on guitar in high school. Hollow Stone is a dark synthesizer piece in the vein of one of Burzum's many such tracks, except a lot better. Sewilo Rune, a track named for the 16th letter in the Germanic runic alphabet, is probably this record's most complex and complete track, mixing a continual acoustic guitar riff with effects pedals, synthesized strings, and piano. There are no words anywhere on this album, unless you count the numerous movie samples from The Wicker Man and another movie, and the unintelligible whispered lyrics on Sewilo Rune, with the exception of one song, Birch White, a great acoustic guitar track mixing slow and faster chords with accordion sections, and lyrics about the shift from winter into spring, taken from a poem by the British writer A.S.J. Testament. This selection of 2 Agalloch full-length albums and 1 EP that I've decided to feature in this video represent the best of my favorite band's releases to me, but Pale Folklore, their debut, is also pretty great, and brings up the same emotions and images within me of wandering through nature as those other 3 releases. When their 4th and 5th full-length releases, Marrow of the Spirit and The Serpent and the Sphere, dropped, I wasn't a fan, but many years later I grew to really appreciate the former, and may soon eventually feel the same about the latter as well, who knows. Opeth, Watershed, May 2008. 2008 was a really big year for me, socially, emotionally, and musically. This year and the previous one were the years I really started to get into music for the first time, and so it's natural an album from one of my favorite bands that happened to drop in that year would end up here. Watershed, at the risk of sounding corny, really was a watershed moment for the band, the last album to date to feature death metal growls. After this one, it's all prog metal. Very heavy guitars for sure, but no growls. We start off with Coil, track number 1. Very nice little folk number, then into a nice spooky Halloweeny piano section, before the beat drops and the guitars just roar to life on Heir Apparent, the next track. Doomy, eerie, menacing riffs, with lots of interesting acoustic and clean electric interludes. I especially like the melancholic, vaguely black metal-y progression that comes in at around 7 minutes and 20 seconds. The Lotus Eater has a sort of interesting call and response thing going on between lead vocalist Micaiah Lokerfeldt's death growls and clean singing, and more strange progressive interludes. Speaking of weird interludes, there's some honest-to-goodness backwards singing on the next track, Hessian Peel, which has some beautiful clean electric progressions as well, especially at the very beginning. My personal top picks, though, would have to be tracks number 4 and 5 of the original version, Burden and Porcelain Heart. Burden is a prog rock masterpiece, bringing together beautiful vocal melodies on the verses, immediately followed by a surprisingly intense organ solo, and a beautiful melancholic electric progression, and Porcelain Heart is a multifaceted piece that's hard to sum up easily. But tell me if you don't love the riff that comes in at around 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And the vocals on top of it. The aggression continues with Hex Omega, where we really see just why some people consider Opeth to be the masters of the outro, with another eerie, doomy riff to play us out, and then some organ before the album draws to a close. Or at least that's what it would be if we didn't have the special edition, which adds Derelict Herds, a wonderful death metal song with aggressive, strained vocals and eerie Middle Eastern keyboards, as well as a cover of a 70s prog rock staple, Bridge of Sighs, and for my money, one of the top 3 best Opeth folk tunes, Den ständiga resan, The Eternal Journey. Another cover, this time of Swedish singer-songwriter Maria Fredriksson, an ironic and unique ending scene to one of the best death metal albums ever. Tyr, Land, May 2008. The final installment in what I consider to be Tyr's classic 4-album run, this one probably has the best opener of any of those records. a menacing, low, and spiteful rendition of a Faroese ballad recounting the curse laid upon Sigmundur Brestesson, the 10th century chieftain and promulgator of Christianity to the Faroe Islands, by his rival chieftain Thrender Eygutu, exhorting for the wrath of Odin and Thor to fall upon his head and the new upstart religion to be driven back into the sea. The energy doesn't let up, as then we get one of Tyr's most popular songs, a reworking of a Norwegian folk ballad telling the story of the Battle of Kringen in the Gudbrand Valley of Norway in 1612, between a ragtag band of Norwegian militiamen and Scottish mercenaries pressed into service by one of their own to enlist in the ranks of the King of Sweden. Then comes my personal favorite on the album, Gotu Rima, with a great vocal melody on the verses. Track number 5, Ocean, is a bit generic, but the lyrics are good. This is a really great lyrical album, for sure. Valkyrian, track number 7, might just be the only fully original Faroese language song in their catalog up to this point, although on later albums they would definitely add a few more. Great vocal and electric guitar melodies all around, and some pretty great drum parts, and some very subtle jangling of acoustic guitar going on in the background to top it all off. Loka Tatur is another great one, with great melodies all throughout. This is actually one of the rare Faroese ballads that includes references to Norse gods, as most of these ballads were written down a good while after Christianization. This ballad being about a farmer that loses a bet with a giant asking the gods for help, and Loki being the one to intervene on his behalf. The title track, Land, comes next, at a monumental 16 minutes long, rather out of character for this band, telling a fairly standard story of Vikings voyaging across the sea that comes off a little underwhelming in comparison to its length. Personally, I think this one is a bit of a dud, alongside Fipan Fagra, track 6. Right after Land, though, we do get a re-recording of one of their most popular older songs, Hail to the Hammer, from the debut album. All in all, Land is a pretty decently consistent record. Tyr have made 5 other records since this 2008 release, and they show no signs of slowing down. They're all pretty young, they tour everywhere, and again, you can't really beat the nostalgia of the first 4 albums for me. Tyr were my favorite band for many years, as I said, before Agalok finally dethroned them after many years of also listening to them. Although they were not my first introduction to folk metal, that would be Helveti, but they are really like no other band, with their mixture of melody and historical themes, and all of those newer records are still pretty good.
All embrace me. It's my time to rule at last. 15 years have I been waiting to sit up on my throne.
Sabaton, Carolus Rex, May 2012. One of the most enduringly popular and inventive power metal bands of all time, hailing from Sweden, Sabaton are known for the booming baritone voice of vocalist Joachim Breden, and have carved out a niche for themselves over 20 years with a particularly unique gimmick. Nearly every single one of their songs are about some sort of historical battle or military event of history, which gives them an understandably wide range of topics to choose from. This particular album is dedicated to both of Sweden's 2 most famous leaders, King Charles XII and Gustav Adolf II, widely known both by their Latin names, Carolus Rex for the former and Gustavus Adolphus for the latter. Over a little over 45 minutes of thudding, relentless, incessant guitar, bass, and drums, we're told the story of the rise and fall of Sweden's golden age between roughly the years of 1611 and 1721. There are some wonderful melodies here, like the dramatic, menacing snarl of the vocals on the closer, Ruina Imperi, and track number 4, A Lifetime of War, which has beautiful and touching melodies from start to finish. But for my money, the standouts here have to be the title track, Bombastic, Heroic, Yngwie Malmsteen, Eat Your Heart Out, and also The Carolean's Prayer, just before it. And for a fun bonus, if you're a weirdo like me, they actually re-recorded the entire album in Swedish as well as English.
From dawn to dawn they're fighting, die will they stand. The fog of war I sleep when armies scorch the land. When all of Europe's burning.
Sufjan Stevens, Carrion Lowell, March 2015. Sufjan Stevens is an American singer-songwriter known for his soft falsetto vocals, skill at the banjo, and unique absurdist lyrics. I've been a Sufjan Stevens fan for basically as long as I've been a fan of underground music, although for nearly all of that time I've only listened to a handful of songs scattered across his many albums. That all changed with the release of this fantastic record, Sufjan's 7th of 9 so far, which is often considered to be his best. This is a great collection of 11 folk songs about love, loss, and life, filled with unique moments, like the barely audible, slowly advancing guitar progression that holds down the atmosphere behind the opening track, or the upbeat, hopeful synths that slide in at around 2 minutes into Should Have Known Better, the album's poppiest cut. One could also single out track number 7, The Only Thing, with the gentle caresses of its slowly upwards and downwards moving cascading progressions on guitar and piano, but my personal most impactful moment, and that of most of the fans of this album, would have to be song number 6, 4th of July, a song made just as memorable by its unique lyrics as by its melodies, poetic and just a little bit obscure without failing to be very direct, raw, and straightforward.
Did you get enough love, my little dove? Why do you cry? And I'm sorry I left, but it was for the best, though it never felt right. My little Versailles.
Obligatory statement of I haven't listened to every Sufjan Stevens album, but from the songs that I've heard on the other albums than this one, and from general consensus from fans, I can also recommend his 3 albums from 2003 to 2005, Michigan, Seven Swans, and Illinois.
I should have known better to see what I could see.
Молчат дома, Etagi, September 2018. I forget where I heard this first exactly, apart from on YouTube. But what led me to it exactly I'm not sure, but this most explosive offering by dour Belarusian electronic outfit Молчат дома is certainly one of the most unique things I've heard in a long time. Soaked in melancholy, paranoia, Молчат дома, translating simply as The Houses Are Silent in Russian, are probably the second best air to Joy Division after Interpol in my view. Far away, synthetic sounding, but still decent drum work complements the baritone vocalist. We start off with Na Dnie, the most upbeat and vibey track, before moving on to the closest thing Etagi has to a single, Tancevat. We're greeted with a fairly well put together, if not a little bland, repeating progression of notes that reminds me of the opening chord progression to a light-hearted horror movie of sorts. But the chorus, with its pleading lyrics and vocals, are really what makes this track my 3rd favorite on the album. The lyrics, if you can manage to track them down, are pretty great. They add to the overall feeling of world weariness and ever so slight misanthropy that I think is one of the album's main lyrical themes. And there are some decent, more politically oriented songs on here too, like the second to last, entitled Komersanti, or Merchants, satirizing capitalism. The singer, Yegor Shkutko, shuffles his way awkwardly through the underwhelming 3rd track, Feel Me, snarling out some lines about "We're not actors, we're not acting." But the band are back in top form with probably my favorite track, Volny, The high-pitched whining synthesizer that takes over in the more energetic sections really creates this intense emotional atmosphere, along with the powerful vocal performance that makes me think of driving a car frantically through a snowstorm. Well, that, or driving a car through a dark, menacing Russian factory complex belching out smoke in the middle of the night, on an endless plain with nothing else around for miles. These whining, high-pitched, melancholic synthesizers, or are they guitars? Apparently there are guitars on this album somewhere. Continue on the fan favorite, Tosca, and the following track, Prognose, while not as emotionally intense, is still a great groovy head-bobbing track. Next up, we have Sudna, probably the album's most unnerving track, with vocals that are very deep and dark, most likely artificially pitched down, which is pretty good, and then Commersanti, that has an interesting synthesizer motif that sounds a little like an organ, and finally Kletka, that has a very Joy Division-esque mood to it, with just repetitive hypnotic aspects to it that are pretty nice. If I had to pick the weakest track, it would probably be the opener, Na Dnie. It seems like this was their sort of attempt at having a happier track. I don't really think it comes off well, especially the higher synth riffs, which are actually pretty annoying, although the lower riff that goes alongside it is actually quite nice. Beach Bunny, Prom Queen / Crybaby EP, September 2019. I first heard about this band from an acoustic singer-songwriter on YouTube, who was also the one to introduce me to Mitski for the first time, and all three of these artists have had a pretty big impact on my life since then. This is a group really primarily focused on the frontwoman, Lily Trufillo, who was using the name Beach Bunny for her solo bedroom pop releases for a while, but from this record onwards, they would be a full band. This is a Chicago-based group really focused around creating great riffs and great guitar melodies. Really, I mean, Lily herself and Matt Henkels, the other guitarist, seem to be playing as a guitar duo on most of the songs here, and from this group in general, which I think really helps to create this very full, rich, melodic, strong aura, thick guitars, if that makes sense. Bright and upbeat, but still very aggressive, very like they know what they want and they're going to get the emotional weight of their songs across no matter what. The opening track here is a song about teenagers and body image. Lily's voice here, plaintive, hopeful. The bridge is so vulnerable and yearning. This is introspective pop punk, but it has such a danceable beat to it. The next track, Painkiller, doesn't let up either. Great chorus. If you've ever been broken up with or broken up with someone, I think you'll appreciate this one. And funny lyrics, too. 6 Weeks starts off with a sort of unexpected, light, airy, soft, jangly intro that's a bit more indie or even maybe shoegaze than pop-punk, but then the energy really picks up, and it builds very slowly, very, very artfully, until the second chorus, which is really the great climax of the song, I think. Adulting is the least popular song on this EP for sure, but I think it's great. It has great drum work, and the chorus has a really nice melody. The last track is called Miss California, and was the last of 3 tracks here to get a music video, along with Prom Queen and Painkiller, and it is as bright and sunny as its namesake state. Strong guitar work, and let me tell you, that chorus. Beach Bunny, Honeymoon, February 2020. This was Beach Bunny's first official full-length album, although they put out a huge slew of EPs, more than anyone else I think on this list, totaling up to at least 2 or 3 full-length albums before this. This is a great one though, with one of the strongest— I know I say this a lot about a wide variety of artists on this video, but one of the strongest opening tracks on this list. Promises. Amazing riff. Cuffing Season also has an interesting intro that starts off with a very basic punk riff, then a short burst of drums, then we get some more generic pop-punk riffs, and then a great, more rockish guitar solo that is quite unique on the other hand. Rear View starts off with a more mellow intro, and it's pretty good, although I think it takes a bit too long to reach the aggressive guitars that would really fit the best alongside the yearning lyrics of Unrequited Love. Colorblind is a little generic, however, but the following song, Racetrack, might seem awkward and out of place at first, but it'll grow on you, trust me. Dream Boy and Cloud9 are both bright, hopeful, celebratory, all the positive adjectives, both with wonderful choruses, definitely both like top 8 Beach Bunny songs for me. But my absolute top pick from this album would have to be April, with its unique vocal note. And that's it. I hope everyone enjoyed. I don't think that I'll do any more music-related YouTube videos for quite a while. I mean, I might do a mirror of the video series A Rough Guide to Metal Subgenres by the YouTuber Perg Productions, since I think that it's a very useful piece of information. I think a lot of the stuff that I'm going to put out for a while is going to be, alongside my own scripts. I think I'll do a lot of mirrors of important informational videos on different topics that I hope to save from digital oblivion, hopefully. And eventually some more Let's Plays, probably, but that could come quite a while in the future. Alright, see ya!